I first noticed the change in Vanessa during what seemed like an ordinary week. At first, it was subtle, barely even noticeable. But I've always observed the small details, the things that other people tend to overlook. Our routines, built over years of marriage, were predictable, almost comforting in their regularity. Every evening, after work, we'd have dinner together, talk about our day, and maybe watch a show before heading to bed. But lately, Vanessa had been pulling away from that rhythm. It started with her coming home late. At first, it was only by a half hour or so. She'd send me a quick text saying she was stuck finishing something at work or caught in a meeting. I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone gets caught up at work occasionally. But soon, it became a pattern. What was once a rare inconvenience turned into a regular occurrence. Every other evening, she had a reason not to be home on time. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was paranoid, but the little seed of doubt had already been planted. Then, there was her phone. I'm not the kind of husband who checks his wife's messages or snoops around. We've always had our privacy. But something about how she was glued to her phone more often than usual gnawed at me. Before, she would leave it lying around, completely unconcerned. Now, it never left her side. At dinner, she'd glance at it every few minutes, her eyes flicking down to check for new notifications. I'd ask her, casually, "Who's that?" And she'd always respond with the same dismissive tone. "Oh, just work." Or sometimes, "It's nothing. Just a group chat." But it didn't feel like anything. The way she held her phone close, the way her thumb moved quickly to turn the screen off whenever I came near, it was subtle, but I noticed. There was a shift in her behavior, a quiet distance growing between us that had never been there before. I started to feel like an outsider in my own home, watching her, trying to piece together what had changed. The nights she came home late became more frequent, and her explanations grew vaguer. I had to stay behind to help out with something, she'd say, or a colleague needed me to go over some reports. I wanted to believe her, I did, but every time she said it, there was a hollowness in her voice, like she was just going through the motions of giving an excuse. And every time she brushed off my questions about her phone, my mind filled with possibilities, unwelcome, dark thoughts that I pushed away as quickly as they came. Her demeanor was different too. Vanessa was always warm, always affectionate. But lately, there was a certain coldness to her. She was distracted and distant, as though she was physically present but mentally somewhere else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping away from me, slowly but surely. We still had our moments. She'd laugh at my jokes, and we'd have brief flashes of the old connection, but they felt forced, like she was trying too hard to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. I would catch her looking at me sometimes, a strange expression in her eyes, something I couldn't quite read. Guilt? Indifference? I wasn't sure, but it only added to my growing unease. The worst part was that I couldn't pinpoint when exactly it had all started. It wasn't as though something major had happened between us to trigger this shift. No fight, no argument. Nothing that would explain why Vanessa had begun drifting away. I racked my brain, trying to figure out if I had done something wrong and if I had somehow pushed her away without realizing it. But I came up empty. There was no clear reason for the distance. It just was. I found myself becoming more anxious and more suspicious. Every time her phone buzzed, I would tense up, waiting for her to react, to see how quickly she would hide it from view. Every time she came home late, I would ask casual questions, trying not to sound accusatory. "How was work today? What kept you so long?" And every time, her answers were vague and unsatisfactory, leaving me with more questions than before. It felt like a slow unraveling. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was starting to fray at the edges. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, didn't want to accuse her of something without proof. But the signs were there, and as much as I tried to ignore them, they became harder to dismiss. Late one night, after she had gone to bed, I sat on the couch in the dark, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand upstairs, and I realized that something was deeply wrong. The quiet ticking of the clock echoed in the living room, and the weight of suspicion settled heavily on my chest. Something was happening, something I wasn't a part of. And deep down, I knew it involved someone else. It happened on a rainy evening, the kind where the sound of water hitting the windows makes everything inside feel a little quieter, a little more intimate. Vanessa had come home late again, but this time, she seemed more tense than usual. She barely spoke during dinner, giving short answers, her eyes flicking to her phone every few minutes as if waiting for something, or someone. I pretended not to notice, trying to keep the conversation light, but I couldn't help feeling the weight of her distraction settling between us. After dinner, she went upstairs to take a shower, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. It was an unusual move. Lately, she'd been glued to it, never letting it out of her sight. Maybe she was in a rush, or maybe she had gotten careless. Either way, I saw my opportunity. My heart started to race, my mind arguing with itself about whether I should even be thinking about checking her phone. But the gnawing suspicion I had been living with was too strong to ignore. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the phone like it was some kind of forbidden object. Part of me hated that I'd been reduced to this, snooping, questioning, doubting the woman I loved. But another part of me, the part that couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, took over. Before I knew it, my hand was already reaching for the phone. As soon as I picked it up, the screen lit up, and there it was, a notification. A message from someone named Dan. My stomach dropped. Dan. I knew that name. It was her ex-boyfriend, the one she had dated before we met. The one she said she had moved on from, left in the past. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stared at the message preview on the lock screen. It wasn't much, just a few words, "Can't stop thinking about." The rest was cut off. But I didn't need to see more. I already knew. A wave of nausea hit me as the implications sank in. Dan. What the hell was she doing texting Dan? And why was he sending her messages like this? My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but before I could even think about opening the message to read the full conversation, I heard the water from the shower upstairs turn off. Panic surged through me. I quickly put the phone back on the counter exactly where it had been. My heart pounding in my chest. I didn't have time to read more, but what I had seen was enough to ignite a firestorm of doubt and anger inside me. I felt sick, my mind spiraling with possibilities. What had they been talking about? How long had this been going on? Was it just harmless flirting, or was it something more? Vanessa came down a few minutes later, fresh from the shower, her hair still damp. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. I tried to act normal, tried to push down the storm of emotions brewing inside me. But I couldn't stop glancing at her phone. It was like a ticking time bomb sitting there on the counter, waiting to explode. She noticed my eyes flick toward it and, in a swift, almost practiced motion, she picked it up, glancing at the screen before locking it and slipping it into her pocket. "Everything okay?" she asked casually, but there was an edge to her voice, a faint trace of nervousness that hadn't been there before. I forced a smile. "Yeah, everything's fine." But nothing was fine. Inside, I was screaming. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand answers. Force her to tell me why the hell she was messaging Dan and what exactly was going on between them. But I didn't. Not yet. I needed more than a single message. I needed to know the full story before I confronted her. So I swallowed my rage, buried it deep, and decided to play the long game. For the rest of the evening, I watched her closely, every glance at her phone, every quick swipe across the screen. She was hiding something, and now I knew exactly where to look. That brief glimpse of her message had opened a door, and behind it, I was sure, was the truth I had been dreading. As the night wore on, I replayed that message over and over in my head, can't stop thinking about. Thinking about what? About her? About the time they had shared? Had they been meeting in secret, reliving old memories, rekindling something I thought had been long dead? The questions gnawed at me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I couldn't even look at Vanessa without seeing her in a new light, as if the person I had loved for years was suddenly a stranger. Every touch, every word felt tainted by the knowledge that there was someone else in her life, someone from her past who had found his way back in. When we went to bed that night, I lay awake long after Vanessa had fallen asleep, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. I needed more than one message. I needed proof, undeniable proof of whatever was happening between them. But now, I have a starting point. Dan, the man she had supposedly left behind, was back in her life, and whatever they were doing, it was happening right under my nose. I stared at the ceiling, the quiet sound of her breathing next to me feeling almost surreal. The trust we had built over the years was starting to crack, and I knew that once it shattered, there would be no going back. After seeing that first message from Dan, my mind wouldn't stop spinning. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. I knew I needed to take things further, that vague suspicions wouldn't be enough. I wanted proof, real, undeniable proof. Something that would rip away all the lies and leave no room for excuses. And to get that, I had to cross a line I never thought I would. It wasn't hard to figure out what I needed to do. The idea had come to me almost immediately after I saw the message. I wasn't proud of it, but my desperation overpowered my guilt. One evening, while Vanessa was in the shower again, I took her phone. My hands trembled as I installed the app, a spyware program designed to monitor texts and calls, and even track her location. It was quick and discreet, and once it was installed, she'd never know it was there. As soon as I hit install, a knot tightened in my stomach. I felt sick, not just because of what I was doing, but because of the reasons that had driven me to it. Was this my life now? Spying on my wife, the woman I had trusted for years? I told myself that I didn't have a choice, that her behavior had left me no other option. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line that we could never come back from. For the next few days, I checked the app obsessively. At first, it was quiet, just mundane texts from her coworkers, some emails, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. I almost started to believe that maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that I was overreacting. But then, it all changed. One evening, I saw her location had changed. She had told me she was going to meet a friend from work for coffee, but the app showed her somewhere else entirely, on the other side of town. My heart raced as I opened the messages on her phone through the app. There it was, Dan. They were meeting, not at some public cafe, but at his apartment. The words "I can't wait to see you again" stared back at me from the screen, and I felt my whole body go cold. I watched, helpless and seething, as they exchanged flirtatious messages, and talked about how they missed each other, how much fun they'd had the last time they met. The more I read, the more the anger grew inside me, building up like a pressure cooker. Ready to explode. They weren't just casually chatting. They were meeting regularly, spending time together in secret, laughing behind my back. She had lied to me, over and over again. And it wasn't just talk. They discussed the details of their meetings, how they would make time for each other when she could sneak away from work or come up with some excuse. They talked about the places they had been, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, Dan's apartment, even the park where they used to go when they were together years ago. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in real time, every message cutting deeper than the last. I started tracking her more closely, monitoring every move, every text, every location. Each time I saw her head toward Dan's apartment, or get a message from him late at night, the betrayal felt sharper, more real. I had all the proof I needed. They were seeing each other behind my back, and it wasn't just some harmless reconnecting between old friends. It was something much worse, something intimate. It was on one of these nights, just a week after installing the app, that I saw it. I'll never forget the moment. I was sitting in the living room, watching the app in real time as Vanessa's location pinged at Dan's apartment again. I had grown numb to the shock by then. The routine of watching her lie and cheat had settled into a dark corner of my mind. But that night, I got more than just messages. I got the final blow, a photograph. The app had synced a photo from her phone. It wasn't some casual snapshot or a group photo with friends. It was a picture of them, Vanessa and Dan, sitting close together on his couch, laughing. She was leaning into him, her hand resting on his thigh, her face glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen from her in months. They looked so comfortable, so familiar, as if I had never existed, as if our marriage meant nothing. My heart stopped. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The image was burned into my mind, and all I could do was stare at it, my entire body frozen with shock. There they were, smiling, their faces close, her body turned toward him in a way that spoke of more than just friendship. It was intimate, it was real, and that was when something inside me shifted. The initial hurt and sadness were replaced by something much darker, much colder. I felt my chest tighten, but it wasn't pain this time, it was anger, raw and sharp, coursing through me like ice in my veins. My hands clenched into fists as I sat there, staring at the photo, every fiber of my being consumed by rage. She had lied to me, deceived me, broken our trust most unforgivably. And now, I had the proof. I had the picture of them together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, as if I were nothing more than a footnote in her life. I could see it all so clearly now, the nights she came home late, the distracted looks, the glances at her phone. All of it had led to this moment, to this revelation. But instead of confronting her right away, I stayed quiet. I didn't yell, didn't scream. I didn't even let her know that I had seen the photo. Instead, I let the cold, calculated fury settle inside me. If she thought she could get away with this, if she thought she could play me for a fool, she was sorely mistaken. They both would pay for what they had done, and I was going to make sure of it. I didn't want just revenge. I wanted to destroy everything that she held dear. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal, to watch her perfect little world crumble around her. And I wasn't going to stop until I had taken everything from her, just like she had taken everything from me. Once the cold anger settled in, I knew what I had to do. Confronting Vanessa in a fit of rage wasn't going to give me the satisfaction I craved. I needed to be methodical, patient, and devastating. I wanted to ruin her, not just in our relationship, but in every aspect of her life. I wanted her to feel the same sense of loss and betrayal I had felt, only worse. Much worse. I started with her parents. Vanessa's family was traditional and deeply rooted in old values. They were the type of people who believed in marriage for life, loyalty, and respect. They loved me, even more than they loved their daughter sometimes, or so it felt. In their eyes, I was the perfect husband, responsible, stable, the man who could provide for their little girl. They had always treated me with warmth, with respect, and I knew that revealing Vanessa's betrayal would shatter their image of her. It would break their hearts, turn them against her, and destroy the tight-knit bond they shared. This was the key to my revenge. But I needed proof. I needed to gather everything, every scrap of evidence so that when I went to them, it wouldn't be my word against hers. It would be undeniable. I wanted them to see the full extent of what she had done, the depth of her deceit. So, I started compiling everything. First, the texts. I went through weeks of messages between Vanessa and Dan, documenting each flirtatious exchange. Each lie she told me about where she was and what she was doing. The app had recorded every word, every time she told him she missed him, every time they planned to meet up. I copied and saved every conversation, making sure to include the timestamps so there would be no doubt about when and how often they had been in contact. Next came the photos. I had several pictures they had exchanged, casual and intimate, and the one that broke me the most, the image of them laughing together on his couch. That photo alone was damning, but I wanted more. I wanted every angle of her betrayal captured, every moment preserved so that she could never deny it. But the real prize came from the audio. The app had been recording their phone calls, and I had hours of their conversations saved. Listening to them talk, hearing Vanessa's voice soft and affectionate as she spoke to Dan, made me physically sick. But I pushed through it, listening to every word, documenting it all. The things she said, the way she laughed at his jokes. The way she spoke about me like I was some distant figure in her life. It was infuriating. I recorded everything, even the most mundane details, because I knew that her parents wouldn't be able to dismiss it once they heard her voice, once they understood the depth of her lies. By the time I was done, I had a complete case against her. A folder filled with texts, pictures, and audio files, all neatly organized and ready to present. But I wasn't going to her parents just yet. No, before that, I had to confront Vanessa. I needed her to see what I had gathered, to watch her world collapse in front of her before I took the final step. I wanted her to understand that her betrayal wasn't just between us anymore, that it was about to destroy her entire life. The night I decided to confront her, I played it cool. I didn't want to give anything away, didn't want her to suspect that her life was about to unravel. I suggested we have a quiet dinner at home, just the two of us. She seemed relieved, maybe thinking that things were getting back to normal between us. I cooked her favorite meal, poured a glass of wine, and set the table like it was any other evening. But inside, I was a storm waiting to erupt. When she came home, I greeted her with a smile, something I hadn't done in weeks. She smiled back, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how to interpret my sudden warmth. We ate in relative silence, making small talk about her day and mine, the tension in the air thick but unspoken. I could see her glancing at me now and then as if trying to gauge my mood, but I kept my composure, acting as though nothing was wrong. After dinner, I invited her to sit with me in the living room. I told her I needed to talk to her, my voice calm, almost too calm. I could see the nervousness flicker in her eyes, but she nodded and sat down across from me. I didn't waste any time. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I had prepared, the one filled with all the evidence of her affair. I handed her the phone and watched her face as she started scrolling through the texts. At first, she didn't react, her eyes scanning the messages, her expression unreadable. But then she saw the pictures. The color drained from her face, her hands started to tremble. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "What? How did you?" She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I said nothing. I simply stared at her, waiting for her to keep going. She flipped through more pictures. More messages, her breath quickening as the reality of the situation set in. And then, I played the audio. I pressed play on one of the recordings, one of their phone calls where they casually planned their next meeting, laughing about how easily they had been hiding it from me. Vanessa's face contorted in pain as she heard her voice, her laughter betraying her. Tears started streaming down her cheeks. She tried to speak, but her words were choked by sobs. "I'm sorry," she finally managed to say. Her voice broken. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please, you have to believe me." I still didn't respond. I just watched her cry, watched her crumble before me. The guilt, the shame, it was all written on her face, but it wasn't enough for me. Not yet. She fell to her knees in front of me, pleading, her hands reaching out to grab mine. "Please, let's talk about this. I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes. I love you, please, just give me a chance to fix this." Her words barely registered. I had already made up my mind long before this moment. I wasn't looking for apologies. I wasn't looking for a way to fix our marriage. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done. I wanted her to suffer. I looked down at her, still calm, still composed. And then I spoke, my voice as cold as the fury inside me. "You'll find out soon enough," I said. "But I'm done talking." With that, I stood up, walked past her as she sobbed on the floor, and left the room. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind still heavy with the events of the previous night. Vanessa was in the bedroom, probably still crying, but I didn't care. My plan was set in motion, and there was no turning back. Today was the day I would take the next step, the most devastating one. I was going to her parents. I had already texted them the night before, asking if we could meet privately. They agreed, of course. Her parents loved me. They had always seen me as the perfect husband, the man who was going to take care of their daughter and build a life with her. They trusted me, and that trust was about to become my most powerful weapon. As I drove to their house, I rehearsed the conversation in my head. I couldn't just storm in and dump everything on them at once. No, I needed to play this carefully, make them feel the weight of the betrayal as deeply as I had. I wanted them to understand the pain, the heartache, and how their precious daughter had shattered everything we had built together. When I arrived at their home, they greeted me warmly, as they always did. Her mother hugged me tightly, concern written all over her face. "Is everything okay, Jonathan? You sounded so serious in your message." Her father, always the stoic one, simply nodded and led me into the living room. I could see in their eyes that they had no idea what was coming. We sat down, and for a moment, I didn't speak. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting, sensing that something was deeply wrong. I took a deep breath and started with the truth, my truth. I told them how much I loved Vanessa, and how she had been the center of my world for years. I talked about our life together, the moments we had shared, and the future I had envisioned with her. As I spoke, I could see them nodding, agreeing, their faces soft with sympathy. But then I shifted. My voice cracked as I told them how things had changed. How Vanessa had grown distant, how she had started lying to me, hiding things from me. I explained how my suspicions had grown, how I had tried to confront her. But she had always deflected, always reassured me that everything was fine. I could feel the tension rising in the room as they listened, their expressions shifting from concern to confusion, and then to something darker. I didn't want to believe it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. I didn't want to think that the woman I married, the woman I gave everything to, could betray me like this. But I found out the truth. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. Her mother reached out and touched my hand. Her face filled with worry. "What are you saying, Jonathan?" I took out my phone, the same one I had shown to Vanessa the night before. "I'm saying that Vanessa has been lying to me. And to you. She's been having an affair. For months." Her mother's hand dropped from mine, and her father sat up straight, his face hardening. I handed them the phone and opened to the folder with all the evidence I had gathered. "Look for yourselves." Her mother hesitated, but her father took the phone first. I watched his face as he scrolled through the messages, his eyes narrowing and his jaw clenching. He didn't say a word, but I could see the fury building behind his calm exterior. Then he handed the phone to his wife. Her mother wasn't as composed. As she read through the texts and the photos, her eyes widened in shock. She gasped, one hand flying to her mouth as she scrolled further and further into the evidence. The photos of Vanessa and Dan, the intimate messages, the recorded conversations, they were all there. Laid out in brutal detail. It was undeniable. Tears welled up in her mother's eyes as she looked at me, her voice trembling. This can't be true, Jonathan. She couldn't. It's true, I said firmly, my voice cold. I wish it wasn't, but it is. She's been meeting him for months. Lying to me, to all of us. This is who she's become. Her mother burst into tears, her sobs filling the room. Her father sat there, frozen in silence, his face red with anger. The air felt thick, suffocating, as they both processed the enormity of what I had just shown them. I didn't want to come to you with this, I continued, my voice quiet but steady. But I thought you deserved to know. You deserved to know the truth about your daughter. Her father finally spoke, his voice low and tight with rage. How could she do this? His hands were balled into fists, his knuckles white as he struggled to keep his composure. How could she betray you like this, betray us? I didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. I had given them everything, shown them the full extent of Vanessa's deceit, and now the consequences were unfolding right in front of me. Her mother continued to sob, her body shaking with grief, while her father sat rigid, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The silence that followed was deafening. Her mother cried openly, her tears soaking into the sleeve of her sweater as she rocked back and forth in her chair, her heart broken by the news. I could see her wrestling with disbelief. But the evidence was too overwhelming. Every text, every photo, every recording, they all painted a picture of betrayal that she couldn't deny. Her father, on the other hand, was a different story. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, and his breathing was heavy, labored as if he was trying to contain the explosion of anger brewing inside him. He stood up suddenly, pacing the room, his hands gripping the back of the chair so tightly I thought he might break it. She's not the daughter I thought she was. He muttered under his breath, his voice low and dangerous. I raised her better than this. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow. Jonathan, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I can't believe she would do something like this. To you, to us? It's unforgivable. Her mother, still sobbing, managed to choke out, how could she? After everything you've done for her, after the life you've built together. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The proof was right in front of them. And their reactions were exactly what I had anticipated. I had torn down the perfect image they had of Vanessa, shattered their illusions about her, just as she had shattered my trust. Her father stopped pacing, finally turning to face me, his expression grim. We can't forgive her for this, Jonathan. I don't know what she was thinking, but it's beyond redemption. I don't see how we can look at her the same way after this. She's not the woman we thought she was. His words were final. And I could see the decision forming in his mind, hardening with every passing second. He had always been a man of principles, a man who valued loyalty above all else. And now, his daughter had violated the very foundation of that loyalty. Her mother nodded through her tears, barely able to speak but agreeing nonetheless. We can't support her in this. Not after what she's done. I sat back, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in. This was the reaction I had hoped for. Vanessa had always cared deeply about her parents' opinion of her. About their approval. She sought it constantly, even as an adult. And now, I had taken that away from her. I had made sure that the one thing she valued more than anything, their love and respect, was no longer hers. As I left their house that day, I knew that when Vanessa eventually found out about this conversation, it would destroy her. And that was exactly what I wanted. A few days passed after I met with Vanessa's parents. I hadn't spoken to her since the night I confronted her with all the evidence. The house was eerily quiet. Her absence didn't bother me, though. The silence felt like a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the past few weeks. I knew that eventually, she would reach out to me, desperate for some form of reconciliation, but I wasn't in any rush. I wanted her to sit with the consequences of her actions, to feel the loneliness creeping in from all sides as her life fell apart. Then, it happened. My phone rang. Her name flashed on the screen. I let it ring a few times before answering. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted her to think I might not pick up at all. When I finally did, I could hear the desperation in her voice immediately. "Jonathan, please? I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. There was no strength left in it, no defiance, no excuses. Just raw fear and hopelessness. "What is there to talk about, Vanessa?" I replied, my tone cold, devoid of any emotion. I wanted her to feel the indifference, to know that I wasn't here to comfort her. To give her the relief she was looking for. "They won't talk to me, Jonathan," she cried. "My parents, they won't even answer my calls. I went to the house, but they refused to open the door. My mother, she looked at me like I was a stranger." Her voice broke, and I could hear her sobbing softly on the other end of the line. I stayed silent, letting her continue, knowing that this was only the beginning of her unraveling. "And it's not just them," she continued, her words now rushed. Frantic. "My friends, they've been distant. Sarah and Emily stopped answering my texts, and when I saw them in town yesterday, they acted like they didn't even see me. Like I wasn't even there." She paused, gasping for breath between sobs. "Jonathan, I've lost everything. Everyone. I don't know what to do." There it was, the complete and total collapse of her life, the isolation that I had orchestrated. I could picture her sitting alone, her once perfect world crumbling around her, with no one left to turn to. And all because of the choices she had made. "This is what you deserve, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady, cutting through her sobs like a knife. "You destroyed everything, our marriage, your parents' trust, your friendships. You did this, not me." She tried to speak, but her words were a tangled mess of apologies and desperation. I know, I made a mistake, but please, Jonathan, please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. Just, please don't give up on me. I need you. I need my family. I can't do this alone." Her pleading only fueled the satisfaction growing inside me. She was finally feeling the weight of her actions, the magnitude of her betrayal. But there was no sympathy left in me for her. Not anymore. "You should have thought about that before, Vanessa, before you decided to betray me. Before you decided to throw everything we had away for him." I paused, letting the silence stretch out between us, hearing only the sound of her crying. "You've made your bed, and now you have to lie in it." She sobbed harder, but I didn't waver. I wasn't going to offer her a lifeline. She had to sink, and she had to sink alone. "I told you before," I said, my voice hard. "You'll find out what happens next. And now you have. This is only the beginning, Vanessa. You're going to lose more than just me. You're going to lose everything that ever mattered to you." "No, please, Jonathan," she begged, her voice cracking, but I had heard enough. "This is all your fault," I said, my voice like ice. "You have no one to blame but yourself." And with that, I hung up the phone, cutting her off mid-soul. For a moment, I just stared at the phone in my hand, the weight of what I had just done sinking in. There was no going back now, no room for second thoughts or regrets. I had destroyed her relationships, just as she had destroyed mine. I had taken from her the most important people in her life, her parents and her friends. And soon, she would realize that there was no way to rebuild what she had broken. As I sat there in the quiet, I felt no remorse, no guilt. Only a cold sense of justice. She had betrayed me, and now, she was paying the price. The decision to file for divorce was not one I made impulsively. It had been building, steadily, in the days following my confrontation with Vanessa. As I watched her world crumble around her, I knew there was no coming back from what she had done. Trust was not something that could be repaired. Not after what I had discovered. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal. Those were wounds that no apology or act of repentance could heal. The only path forward for me was to sever the tie completely. I made the arrangements quietly and efficiently. I found a lawyer, gathered the necessary documents, and filled out the paperwork without any hesitation. Every step felt cold and methodical, but it was exactly what I needed. There was no room for emotion now. Not anymore. A few days after I had filed, I told her. She had come over to the house, still clinging to the hope that somehow, things could be repaired. She stood in the living room, looking as fragile as I had ever seen her. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying, and she looked smaller, like the weight of everything had physically shrunk her. But even in her broken state, she tried to smile, tried to bridge the enormous distance between us with her words. "Jonathan," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading, "I know I've hurt you. I know I've made mistakes, but I swear to you, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can talk, we can start over." I stood there, arms crossed, feeling nothing but a deep, unshakable sense of finality. The more she spoke, the more certain I became that this was the right decision. It's over, Vanessa, I said firmly, cutting through her words. I've filed for divorce. Her face fell as if I had physically struck her. She blinked, her mouth slightly open, the color draining from her cheeks. What? No, you can't be serious. I'm serious. I've already started the process, I continued, my voice cold and deliberate. There's nothing left to talk about. We're done. She took a step closer, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jonathan, please don't do this. We can fix it, I'll do anything, I swear. Just give me a chance. I shook my head, unmoved by her desperation. There's nothing to fix. You destroyed everything. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she looked at me like she was searching for any sign of softness, any sign that I might change my mind. But there was none. I had given her everything, and she had thrown it away. There was no part of me left that could forgive her. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I love you. I'll make it right. I swear I will. Just don't leave me like this. Don't end us. The irony of her words hung heavy in the air. Love? That word had long since lost its meaning between us. If she had truly loved me, she wouldn't have done what she did. She wouldn't have betrayed me, lied to me, shattered the life we had built together. Now, her pleas sounded hollow, as if she was trying to grasp something that no longer existed. I already have, I replied, my voice flat. You ended us the moment you started seeing him. This is just the final step. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. But I felt nothing. I watched her, this woman I had once loved, and realized that she no longer had any hold on me. The bond between us was severed, broken beyond repair, and I had no intention of trying to fix it. As she cried, she said through her sobs, I don't know how to live without you. You're everything to me, Jonathan. Please don't leave me alone. The irony stung, but I wasn't going to let her pull me back into her web of manipulation and guilt. I knew this was a tactic, whether intentional or not, to appeal to the part of me that once cared for her. But that part was dead. I was done. You should have thought of that before, I said coldly. Before you decided to ruin everything. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that this was happening. But it was, and there was no going back. I'll have my lawyer contact you with the details, I added, already turning to leave. From now on, we'll handle everything through them. I walked out of the house, her sobs still echoing behind me, but they didn't reach me. The door closed, and with it, a chapter of my life. A chapter that had once been filled with love, hope, and promises for the future, but that now lay in ruins, just like her world. In the days that followed, Vanessa tried to reach out again, leaving me voicemails, sending me long, apologetic texts, and trying to convince me that we could salvage something from the wreckage. But I ignored them all. Each message was just another reminder of how far we had fallen, how deep the betrayal had cut, and how there was nothing left to save. I knew that her world was crumbling around her. Her parents had turned their backs on her, her friends had distanced themselves, and now, I was walking away too. Every day, she was forced to face the consequences of her choices. Every day, she was reminded that she had no one to blame but herself. I had thought that maybe I would feel some satisfaction, some sense of victory in watching her suffer, but in the end, all I felt was nothing. The emptiness left by her betrayal had consumed everything, even the need for revenge. The divorce would be the final nail in the coffin, the last step in closing this painful chapter for good.